Okay, tonight we are in Nehemiah, and background to Nehemiah is essentially the same as the background to Ezra. Judah had come out from under Babylonian control when the Medo-Persians overwhelmed the Babylonians. They had first been taken into captivity 606, 597, then 586 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. 3 stages in, and as we'll see, 3 stages out as well. We've already seen the return under Zerubbabel. There were the majority of returnees that came back in his day. Ezra was accompanied by something less than 2,000 men, 1,754, according to my notes. And that may have been supplemented by women and children. But when Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem, or when Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem, I guess this would have been his first time there, most likely. Nehemiah is not accompanied, as far as we can tell, by any significant number of Jews. Now, there may have been Jews who went with him, but they're not mentioned. What he is accompanied by is a significant force of Persian military. And that sets a dramatically different stage for circumstances under Nehemiah as opposed to Zerubbabel and Ezra. Now, you have 3 stages of deportation from Judah's territory, and now with Nehemiah, 3 stages of, I guess you could call it, return or re-importation or what have you, just as has been prophesied. Jeremiah, who was contemporary with the destruction, had foretold all of these events, that the city, the nation would fall, that captivity would ensue. The only details really that we have of the 70 years of captivity really are the last half of the book of Ezekiel, the second 24 chapters of Ezekiel. And that doesn't give us any great detail of the day-to-day affairs. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra picks up where Second Chronicles leaves off, and Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 simply tell us this is a continuation of Judah's history. Ezra and Nehemiah fill different roles in their work in Jerusalem. When Ezra returns about the year 457, 458 BC, 458, 457, it counts down, his responsibility is primarily as a spiritual leader. And he is instrumental in pushing the people to pick up and improve, but he spends roughly 13 years in Jerusalem, and in terms of restoring the city, making any significant progress on rebuilding the walls and so forth, nothing happens. And we look at this, and critical scholars look at this and would consider him a failure, but Ezra is lacking something that Nehemiah has when he comes, and that is the imprimatur, the authority of the Persian government. Ezra is able to accomplish what he does accomplish largely because the kings, the emperors who had stopped things had died, and so the force of their laws largely died with them. Nehemiah is going to be able to accomplish a great deal more and in a short period of time because he has the full backing and authority of the king. Nehemiah returns not simply as a leader among his people, but Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem as governor of Judea, and that's a significant difference. Up to this point, the territory of Judea seems to have been part of the province of Samaria, and the influence of the Samaritan governor, in this case Sanballat, was not favorable to the Jews. There is some indication in history that Sanballat may actually have been of the tribe of Ephraim originally, so a member of the northern kingdom, such as they were, one of those left behind perhaps. Needless to say, there was no love lost between Sanballat and the Jews, much less Tobiah. And when Nehemiah returns, even though he meets with Sanballat on his way to Jerusalem, he does not disclose the full extent of his authority and his orders from the king. Ezra and Nehemiah have different roles. Ezra focuses on the spiritual, Nehemiah focuses on the national, but they're complementary to each other in fulfilling God's purpose. Now, we've talked about how Ezra and Nehemiah were treated until recently, relatively 500 years ago, 600 years ago, treated as one book until from the time of Baba Bathra until about the 1400s AD. The basic explanation for that was that the Hebrews grouped all the books of the Old Testament under the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, 22 letters, 22 books of the Hebrew Bible. That's why you have the 12 so-called minor prophets simply collected as the 12, and Ezra and Nehemiah grouped together to fit that grouping. A lot of scholars try to attribute Nehemiah to Ezra as the inspired writer. Of course, a lot of them also question his inspiration and argue about dates and so forth. Both Ezra and Nehemiah cite external sources for information in what they write. In Ezra chapter 1, verses 2, 3, and 4, chapter 4, verses 8 and following, chapter 6, verse 3, and so forth. Ezra particularly cites external sources. That does not take away from the inspiration of what he writes. That simply acknowledges that this was information readily available to anybody that wanted to cross-check it. Scholars tend to credit Ezra as the inspired writer of Nehemiah. But if you take your Bible and just begin to read right at the very beginning, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, it appeared in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa the capital, or Shushan the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. Nehemiah writes in the first person. Is it possible that Ezra actually wrote this down? Certainly. Ezra would have had access to all of Nehemiah's official records, probably to Nehemiah's personal records and writings as well, whatever library Nehemiah had available to him, Ezra would have had access to. Is it entirely possible that Ezra recorded or copied out what Nehemiah had written? Certainly. Is it possible that Nehemiah might even have dictated this to Ezra? Very possibly. Who was Ezra? Ezra was first and foremost a scribe, a priest. Having him write down what Nehemiah stated would have been nothing out of the ordinary as far as Ezra's training and abilities were concerned. By the same token, Nehemiah had occupied a high-ranking position in the palace in Shushan or Susa long before he ever came to Jerusalem. So there's no reason whatsoever to suppose that Nehemiah was in any way less than perfectly literate and capable of writing this down himself. So whether he dictated this to Ezra, who then wrote it down, or penned it with his own hand, Nehemiah is the inspired writer. Who put pen to paper is immaterial. Now, as I said, just as the people had gone into captivity in stages, they came out of captivity in stages. The total number given by both Ezra and Nehemiah in the parallel records, Ezra chapter 2, Nehemiah chapter 7, they're almost word for word identical. 536, Zerubbabel led 49,937 people back to Jerusalem. That's by far the biggest group of people. And that would seem to, for the most part, be just men, not counting women and children. So as we've talked about before, it's possible the actual number might have been more than that. But in 458 BC, several Persian rulers later, Ezra comes back with a second group of captives, roughly speaking, 1,750 odd men. And there is an intense, but rather short-lived spiritual revival during Ezra's day. And I say short-lived because Ezra dealt with the issue of mixed marriages, religiously mixed marriages, and there was a wholesale commitment to correct this problem in his initial work. But in 445, when Nehemiah shows up, only 13 years later, what do we find? This problem still exists, or it may be more the case, this problem has reasserted itself in Jerusalem and in Judah. Now, Nehemiah's name comes from the Hebrew Nehemiah, which means the comfort of the Lord, or whom the Lord Jehovah has comforted. So where we have Malachi, a contemporary of Nehemiah, whose name basically translates as messenger or angel, Nehemiah's purpose is to comfort, but in a very forceful way. Now, I said Ezra was the spiritual leader in his time. He's a priest. He's a scribe. He has no particular civil authority except as the Jews themselves offer him obedience or pay attention to his words. He doesn't have any civil authority from the Persian government. Judah is part of Samaritan territory. Now, it's during this period that a neighboring satrap, whose name is Megabizos, historically begins to be pretty, I guess you'd say, obstreperous. He begins to be pretty powerful and somewhat independent of the Persian rulers. So by the time Nehemiah comes along, by the time that he is allowed with Persian authority to basically to go in and constitute a new province separate from the Samaritans, separate from the Amorites, and separate from these folks ruled by Megabizos, it serves the Persian ruler's purpose to set up an alternative state, an alternative province in this area, even if it's small, even if it's comparatively weak militarily. It serves his purpose because this new governorship becomes an effective counterweight to the arrogance and the ambitions and the independence of some of these neighboring satrapies. Now, remember, it's, depending on which way you go, it's between 700 and 1,000 miles from the home base of the Medo-Persian Empire. It depends on whether you're traveling from Babylon, which is about 700 miles, or from Susa or Shushan, which is about 850 miles, or from Ecbatana, which is the ancestral capital of the Medes, which would be roughly 1,000 miles. Depending on where you're coming from, it's between 700 and 1,000 miles from the capitals of the Medo-Persian Empire to the Promised Land, to the territory of Palestine. And so all of these neighboring provinces, even though they're ostensibly under the thumb of the Medo-Persians, it's a long trip and it's a long time just to communicate back and forth. Now, the Persians did have a very effective mail system, just like the Babylonians. In Babylonian times, it was possible to send word from one side of the empire to the other. And that would basically have been from about the Indus River in Western India all the way to the Mediterranean and down into Egypt or even to what is modern Ethiopia, it was possible to send a letter within 3 to 4 weeks. They had a comparatively efficient mail system. During the period, the early years of the captivity of Judah, before the destruction of Jerusalem, those who were already in captive from Ezekiel's deportation, or even from Daniel's going all the way back to 606, these people were in communication with their kinfolks back in Judah, and vice versa, by mail. But to move troops, to move people, to move equipment from anywhere on the eastern side of the empire, which is where they would have been strongest because that's their home territory, to move an army from there, or even just a significant detachment of people, that's not a matter of a few weeks. That's a matter of 3 to 4 months to traverse that 700 to 1,000 miles, because they're not going to move at a rapid rate normally. So Nehemiah comes on the scene as the governor of basically the new province of Judah, or Judea. And he comes with civil and military authority as governor. Judah is now detached from the territory and the authority of the Samaritans or the Amorites, any of the neighboring people. Finally, they are fundamentally independent. Well, this is going to upset the apple cart for a whole lot of their neighbors. For the 60 odd years since the time of Zerubbabel that they have been back in the land of promise, they've largely been under the thumb of their neighbors. That's going to change dramatically. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah are the record of the restoration, the record of Jeremiah's prophecies being fulfilled, the record of God keeping his promise, the record of Ezekiel telling the truth from Ezekiel chapter 1 to chapter 48. They show that God keeps his promises to his people. They emphasize the people's responsibility to be holy, to actually follow through on their promises and their vows and their commitments. And in Nehemiah, the major project is to rebuild the walls of the city. Now, had there been no effort whatsoever up to this point, we know that's not the case. Ezra had taken part of this in hand, but it has been stopped. It has been stymied during this time period. Going back to the beginnings of Nehemiah, what do we know about Nehemiah the man? Well, where we know that Ezra was a Levite and a scribe, we don't have in the book of Nehemiah his genealogical record. Now, there are some Jewish sources that tell us that Nehemiah was of the tribe of Judah, and some even say that he was of the house of David, so of the royal house. But there's also a statement that he offers sacrifice, and some commentators take that as indicating that he was a Levite. That seems to be a pretty weak supposition from the standpoint that we read throughout Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles of this one or that one, kings and so forth, offering sacrifice, when in fact they are making the offering and a priest is actually carrying out the action of sacrificing it. So it's a pretty specious contention to say that he must have been a Levite because he offered sacrifice. We look at his life before he comes to Jerusalem, and you think about it, Nehemiah had a good life. If he was of the tribe of Judah, and there's no reason to suppose he wasn't, after all, that's who the majority of the people in captivity from Jeremiah's time were. Even if he's of the house of David, he's had a good life in the Medo-Persian Empire. We don't know how old he is, but he's old enough that he has become cupbearer to the king. He is in a position of responsibility, a position of honor, a position of not small influence. He is in a position where he is probably paid or supported very well, living a really pretty luxurious life overall. Now, the role of cupbearer to the king was a tremendously responsible one, and it was not something that was given to someone who was in whom there was not perfect trust. Ancient records tell us that the responsibility of the cupbearer was to wash the king's cup in his presence, and then before filling it with whatever the king was going to drink, to pour out into his own hand enough that he could drink, to taste whatever the king was going to drink and demonstrate that it was safe for the king to drink it, and then with the other hand to give the king his cup to drink. So this is a position of responsibility, of honor, a position of trust. But even there, that trust is constantly verified for the sake of the king's safety. 13 years transpire between Ezra and Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is going to do something that not even Zerubbabel seems to have done to any great extent. Zerubbabel reestablishes the national presence in a sense. Nehemiah is going to reestablish the national government for all practical purposes. It's obvious that before he ever comes to Jerusalem, he is a man who is well regarded. He's held in high esteem in Persia. And when he comes to Jerusalem, it is by his own request, and he comes as governor. He could not have asked to be governor just on a whim. He had to be a man with some clout, with some credibility in the king's court. Now, we'll talk about this a little more in a minute, but you think about what has taken place during the reign of this particular king. And this is Artaxerxes I Longimanus, reigns from, roughly speaking, 465 down to about 424. So this takes place right in the middle of his rather long reign. This man has already given the order that stops any rebuilding of the walls in the days of Ezra. Now, in 445, here comes Nehemiah with orders countermanding those previous orders, and certainly countermanding orders that go back to Darius Hystaspes before him, stopping the people from building. Nehemiah did not leave Shushan with the expectation of staying years and years and years and years and years, most likely. He leaves Shushan in 445 for what would be a 3 to 4 month trip just to get to Jerusalem, and then time enough to stay in Jerusalem and accomplish what he goes there to do, which is rebuild the walls, reestablish Jerusalem as a fortified city, and then 3 or 4 months to return. So his leave of absence from the court would be at least a year, and probably more likely 2. And then as time goes by, it would seem that he either requested or was allowed to extend his stay. He's going to stay until about the year 433, so roughly 12 years. And then he will return to Shushan, to the palace, make his report, and we will find that he is returned then about the year 433, 432 for a second term as governor of Judah. And how long that lasts, we don't know. We have here, though, in the book of Nehemiah, his mission to Jerusalem, the reforms that he institutes, Nehemiah is not a priest, as far as we can tell, but his work complements what Ezra has done. It reinforces everything that Ezra has tried to do. His work also is contemporary with the last of the Old Testament prophets, except for John, and that's Malachi. And from what we can determine from secular records and so forth, Nehemiah's record is historically accurate. As believers, we have no reason to question it otherwise, but secular history confirms that it's historically accurate. One of the things that we see here over this time span from Ezra to Nehemiah and then down through the work of Nehemiah is that restoration is an ongoing process. Restoration is a generational necessity, if you will. Every generation needs to connect back to the foundation of our faith. And that's something that we have seen just in our own generations. We don't always do well. Go back to the book of Judges, and in Judges chapter 2, what do you read in the first few verses? The children of Israel were faithful all the days of Joshua. They were faithful all the days of those who were Joshua's generation. They were faithful in the days of Joshua's children's generation. But the grandchildren, the third generation, there arose a generation that knew not the Lord nor the power of his mighty works. Things went downhill from there. And just in our own lifetimes, we're old enough to see that takes place in the church as well. Restoration is a constant process. So just a rough outline of the book of Nehemiah. You've got 13 chapters here. The first 7 chapters, the first half of the book, really focuses on rebuilding the wall and the reforms that Nehemiah institutes during his first governorship. And so he hears what's going on. He hears the circumstances of Jerusalem in chapter 1. And from chapter 2 into chapter 3, he comes to Jerusalem. He is granted leave to travel. He is authorized. He's given a military escort. And that's not just a couple of soldiers, apparently, but a considerable company of military personnel. He comes to Jerusalem. And in chapter 3, you have the record of the reconstruction of the wall and the order in which it was done. It went counterclockwise around Jerusalem, starting from the north and moving around through the valleys and then back up the east side. In chapter 4, during the course of construction, he encounters opposition. Enemies try to block what he's doing. Now, who are the enemies? Notably, Sanballat and Tobiah. Who are they? They seem to be the governors of adjoining territories, of Samaritan territories, Sanballat particularly, and up to this point, he would have had jurisdiction over the territory of Judah. And Nehemiah does not acknowledge his authority. So what do Sanballat and Tobiah end up doing? Well, now we've got to check with the king. We've got to check with Artaxerxes. What does that entail? If they're going to go themselves, you know they're not going to ride like post riders. They're going to travel in style as befits the governors of their respective territories and so forth. It's going to take several months to get there and several months to get back. Well, in the meantime, what's Nehemiah doing? Building walls. So by the time they can get back, it's a fait accompli. We'll talk about that a little more as we go along. One of the other things, though, that we discovered is that external opposition is not the only problem Nehemiah has to deal with. You come to chapter 5 and you discover here a big part of the problem, and undoubtedly a big part of the problem for Ezra as well, is internal opposition. The priests are not on board. There's a significant party of priests who are not on board with reinstituting a strict observance of the law of Moses. And this seems to be an expression of the outpouring of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the folks who would eventually become the Herodian party here about 350 years down the road from here. There is division, and there is a significant portion, even among the priesthood, of folks who are basically pretty secular in their approach to things. And that's where the opposition comes from. In chapter 6, you still find opposition, resistance, slow walking things and what have you, but the wall is finished. And in chapter 7, Nehemiah is going to find the last of the first remaining exiles. So the last of the folks that came back with Zerubbabel are who he's going to encounter in chapter 7. Well, that sets the stage then for chapters 8, 9, and 10. The wall is finished. We've accomplished this. We've set things on their way. In chapters 8, 9, and 10, now we're going to read the law out in public. And the ceremonies that the pomp and circumstance, if you will, that go with it are going to resume. And we look at this and say, wait a minute, I thought this was done. I thought these things were taken care of by Ezra. Well, Ezra is one man. And Ezra had opposition from within his own ranks, that is, from among the priesthood. So, even though in Ezra's initial work there was great positive response, it's clear that didn't last. And so now we've got to set things right once more. The law is read. The Feast of Tabernacles is kept in chapter 8. The Levites then in chapter 9 are put in a position of leading in a psalm of confession, and the people promise in chapter 10, they make a vow of faithfulness. So during this time, from 445 down to about 433 roughly, 11 to 12 years, we're building, and that all takes place the first 3 months that Nehemiah is there. And then we're setting things in order and getting things back on track. And then Nehemiah has to go back to Shushan and report. It says a lot about Nehemiah, but it also says a lot about the political circumstances of the moment, that the king turns him around and sends him back for a second term as governor. And so in chapters 11, 12, and 13, you have a census of the residents of Jerusalem and the other cities, and the priests and the Levites, and a dedication, an official dedication, if you will, for the wall. That is, he has reported to the king, I've done what I set out to do, and it's finished, and okay, good, go dedicate it in my name, that kind of thing. And notice in chapter 13, two other things that take place. Number one, foreigners are expelled. Now, this is not a xenophobic act, but rather the influence of those who are not committed to living according to the law of Moses. Those people are put out. And religious reforms are instituted for the purpose of purifying the nation. What makes this interesting is that this is the time frame now, 430 down toward 400, somewhere in there. This is the time frame of Malachi. And in the 4 short chapters of Malachi, what do we see played out between God and the people? Malachi acts almost like a prosecuting attorney on behalf of God, calling the people into judgment. And he begins to list out God's charges or God's complaints against them. You have scorned me. You have ignored me. You have held me up to contempt, and so forth. And every time in Malachi's writing, How do they respond? Why, how have we done that? What are you talking about, Malachi? And so he then begins to give the specifications of each charge. You did this, you did this, you did this, you did this. All of this comes somewhere right in this same time frame. Now, is this exactly the same time as the reforms that Nehemiah is putting in place? I don't know. But the thing that stands out, or should stand out here, is that from 536 down to the end of Malachi's service, let's say 400, God gives Judah opportunity after opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to get it right. He gives them chance after chance after chance to make good on their commitment of faithfulness. And what do? They invest themselves as a nation, not every person, obviously, but as a people, and with the leadership of the Levites, they invest themselves in their national political identity more than they ever had before. What happens is that as they come back into the land of promise, what's the ostensible purpose? We're going to observe the law of Moses correctly. We're going to get it right this time. Well, who does that put in charge of things for the most part? The priests, the Levites. And they begin to cling first to their ecclesiastical power, but then ultimately to civil and political power, because Judah is a theocracy and the law of God is also the law of the land. So now they're going to hold on to their civil and political power to the point that when, after Alexander the Great's time, when the Maccabees rise to power in the 2nd century BC, there will actually be moves made to put a priest on the throne. And in the days of the original Maccabean family, Judas's family, they resist. But we get down to the days of Alexander Jannaeus, about 100 years before Christ. And at that point, they're not so resistant to the idea of a priest on the throne, because they have consolidated so much political power in their hands that they're the de facto rulers of the land, even if they're not the actual kings. So this is, in Nehemiah's and Malachi's day, this is God's, basically his last opportunity for them to get it right. And even though they do well under Nehemiah's leadership, it's just like it's the same tale that we see with the righteous kings of Judah, when Asa and Jehoshaphat and Asa and Hezekiah and Josiah lead in reforms. The people do well, but only as long as the king's alive. So the people do well as long as Nehemiah is in charge, but Nehemiah, he's already a grown man when he gets there in 445. He's anywhere from 30 to 40, 50 years old at that point. He's going to rule and govern for a period of 15 or more years over 2 governorships. So he's going to be a man in his late 40s up to maybe 70, depending on how old he was when he got there. Sooner or later, he'll be out of their way. And then they have to make the decision: are we going to continue in his righteous way, or are we going to consolidate to ourselves whatever power we can get? Historically, we know exactly what choice they made. So let's get to the text then in Nehemiah. Let's thoughts or questions before we do.
Well, not mine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in chapter 1, we're introduced to Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, and that's basically all we know of his background. It happens in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the capital. Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. All right. This is the first part of the book. We're going to see the reconstruction of the wall. Here's where Nehemiah hears about the helplessness of the situation in Jerusalem. And the month of Kislev corresponds to late November into December. It's a winter month in Persia, in the Middle East. It's roughly speaking the last part of November, first part of December. Shushan, or Susa, the capital of the Persian part of the empire, is roughly 200 miles east of Babylon and about that many miles inland from the head of the Persian Gulf. So it's in Iran, modern day Iran. It's roughly 300 miles south and east of Ecbatana, which is the ancient Median capital. And that word, Susa or Shushan, means lily, something brightly colored. It's the root of the English names Susan or Susanna. And he was in the citadel or the palace of Artaxerxes. Now, Hanani, or Hanani, however you want to pronounce his name, is described as Nehemiah's brother. In Acts chapter 2, as Peter and the apostles are preaching the first gospel sermon, Peter says, "Let all the house of Israel know assuredly that this same Jesus whom you crucified, God has made both Lord and Christ," verse 36. And how do the people, the assembled Jewish people, respond in verse 37? Men and brethren, men and brothers, what shall we do? Now, this crowd of people were not the literal biological brothers of Peter and the apostles. It's a figure of speech, meaning fellow countrymen. Well, here in Nehemiah chapter 1, he talks about Hanani, one of my brothers, with certain men from Judah. Scholars and commentators argue back and forth about whether or not Nehemiah is using this word brother to describe a fellow countryman or actually one of Nehemiah's biological siblings. I believe it's the latter. I believe this is one of Nehemiah's family members, for the simple reason that he is distinguished separately as my brother, in distinction from men of Judah, who would also be brethren in the civil sense, in the civic sense, fellow citizens, but he doesn't call them my brothers. I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. Now that's an interesting way in the English Standard of describing this, the Jews who had escaped. Now, Nehemiah made the inquiry. According to Josephus' record of this time period, what happened was that Nehemiah was walking through the palace in Shushan, and he overheard men speaking Hebrew, and that pricked up his ears, and he listened and inquired, then, what are y'all talking about? What's going on? Well, I don't know if Josephus knew anything about this other than just to make this up or not, but it does appear that Nehemiah initiated the inquiry and learns of sorry conditions in Jerusalem. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. Now, a couple of things here. Nehemiah describes them as those who escaped. Well, they had been paroled. They had been allowed to go home by Cyrus. And so that word escaped is a figure of speech more than a statement of fact about how they wound up back in Jerusalem, back in Judah. But he talks about the wall and the gates. And there's no way that this could be reasonably a reference to the walls from the days of Jeremiah, from the days of Nebuchadnezzar, tearing things down and destroying the gates. That was 100+ years in the past at this point. That was almost 150 years in the past at this point. That was common knowledge that the city had been in ruins for decades. But from Nehemiah's standpoint, you have Zerubbabel, who had returned with enough people to reestablish the nation. You have Ezra, who has led several hundred people back and ignited a religious revival, at least temporarily. But what had happened during Ezra's time? Just like it had during Zerubbabel's time. Everything that the Jews had tried to do, they encountered opposition. And so that would certainly have included any effort to construct the walls. The neighbors, the Samaritan peoples and so forth, had sought to frustrate their rebuilding, had interfered in every way they could, had even appealed for imperial authority for them to stop. So as he describes it here, the city is in distress in verse 3. They're in great trouble. They're in shame. They're in reproach. Distress describes their physical condition. Their physical condition is that they're unprotected. Now, if you are surrounded by hostile people and you have no defenses, you're going to be in a continuous state of distress, in a continuous state of physical uncertainty, because what's to stop them from raiding, from imposing their will on you and so forth. And that's what has been going on here. As we'll see as we get farther into Nehemiah, the roots go a lot deeper than we even realize at this point. But that other word, reproach or great shame, that's the mental aspect of it. That's the emotional aspect of it. Who are these people? They're supposed to be God's people, the children of God, his chosen nation. They've been in captivity. They've suffered their punishment. They've been allowed to come back. They've reestablished the nation and the city, at least sort of. And they're not prospering. And they're not doing well. And that's going to prey on their minds and prey on their spirits. And that may even call into question in the backs of their minds God's ability to prosper them. And so they're in a sorry state. And Nehemiah's reaction is profound. You look at verse 4, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Well, he mourned for certain days. He fasted. He doesn't say how long, but it's interesting to notice that from this point to the time that he actually his countenance is noticed by the king and the whole circumstance comes to the king's attention, is about 4 months that he is seemingly is mulling over and mourning over this and puzzling over what to do. Did he fast long enough that it became physically obvious, that he lost weight, that it showed in his face? I don't know. But we do know that when the king notices, it's because he doesn't look the same. He looks downcast. He looks haggard in some way. And that's not good in the presence of the king when you're the guy who is charged with making sure that the king is not poisoned, because it could very well leave the impression you're up to something and you're distressed about something that's not good for the king's health. But regardless of that, before we get to that point, Nehemiah's reaction is profound. He weeps. This is distressing to him. It's upsetting to him. I sat down and wept. I mourned for days. I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And you have his prayer. And he opens in verse 5 with words of praise, words of adoration for God. And rightly so. O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We'll stop there for just a second. He acknowledges the character of God. God is a promise keeper, not a promise breaker. But he also acknowledges the character of God's promises, doesn't he? Who keeps covenant with those who keep their covenant with him. God doesn't give very many blanket unconditional promises in history. God's promises typically have strings attached or conditions attached to them. And Nehemiah acknowledges that. Implicit in that acknowledgement is, okay, if our people are suffering, if our city is not prospering, if there's a problem in Judah and Jerusalem, the problem is not God. The problem is us. If there's a problem there, it may be all of us scattered throughout the world, not just the folks there. But the problem is us, not God. God keeps his promises for those who keep his commandments, who love him. If good things are not happening to God's people, what does that imply about God's people? We must not be loving him like we ought to. We must not be keeping his commandments like we ought to. Well, certainly, even though he probably was not even born at that point, certainly Nehemiah would be very well aware that in the years leading up to captivity, one of the major complaints God had lodged against his people is, you go through the motions of worshiping me, but that's all you're doing. Your heart is not in it. You're speaking empty words. It's not a matter of ritual, it's a matter of righteousness. And certainly Nehemiah would have been aware of that, just like Ezra. So you look down here at verse 6, and now he personifies God as a mediator. Let your ear be attentive, let your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant, that now I pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. Now, let's take that apart piece by piece. He acknowledges God as a mediator. He's not a priest like Ezra. He is what we would describe as a layman. Let your ear be attentive, your eye open to the prayer of your servant. To me, an ordinary guy, basically. And he acknowledges sin. I'm confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you, and even I and my father's house have sinned. So we look at this, and a question arises: how had Ezra sinned, or Nehemiah rather sinned? What had he done that he would feel some personal sense of responsibility for this condition, this situation?
I don't know that we know anything.
We don't. We don't have any detail there. But whatever it was, Nehemiah feels a sense of personal responsibility at this point. It may have been as simple as, I've been living basically in oblivion without regard to what was going on in Jerusalem until I got this word. I've been going about my business as the cupbearer to the king. I've been living a comfortable life here. Things are not good there, and I've got it really good here. And I haven't been paying attention. We don't know. We could speculate till the cows come home. But he makes a personal as well as a corporate acknowledgement of sin. He says in verse 7, we have acted corruptly. That is, we have done things wrong. We have committed sins. We have not kept the commandments and the statutes and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. He's acknowledging sins of commission, things that they've actively done that are wrong, and sins of omission, things they ought to have done that they had not done. And that may well be where his personal responsibility comes into this. I haven't been paying attention. I haven't been involved the way I should have been in this. After all, who is Nehemiah? He's a man with considerable influence.
Yeah.
He's a man with the king's ear to some degree. Even if he is a servant, and he is a high-ranking servant. He is a man who is in a position to know a lot of what's going on in the empire. And certainly he's in a position to know, and perhaps to have known long before now, of the difficulties going on in Jerusalem and Judah, and perhaps he just had not paid attention. We could only speculate on that. But then he asks, remember, we've committed sins, we've not done things we should have, we've not kept the mitzvah, the commandment, the memorial, as it were. We've not observed the statutes, those things that are written down, an ordinance even, the ordinances or the rules, as the English Standard says, that you commanded your servant Moses, those things that are set to govern the people. And so he says, verse 8, remember the word that you commanded to your servant Moses. If you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. If you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I'll gather them and bring them to the place that I've chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you've redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. So Nehemiah knows the scriptures, and he demonstrates that here in the course of his prayer. He knows what Leviticus chapter 6 had said in verse 33, if you're unfaithful, I'll scatter you. Well, what happened? They'd been unfaithful, and God had scattered them. First the northern kingdom, then the southern kingdom. And to that day, they largely remained scattered. After captivity, they would, by their own choice, largely continue to be scattered throughout the world. Now, if you return to me, now he's quoting Moses from Deuteronomy chapter 30, starting at verse 2. If you return, then I will restore you. And they've made a show of returning, but they haven't returned in any great degree of conviction for any lengthy period of time. I'll gather them there, bring them. That's Deuteronomy chapter 30, picking up at about verse 4, to the place that I've chosen. Well, where's the place? Deuteronomy 12 and verse 5. This land, this house, this city, Jerusalem, these people whom you've redeemed. And the interesting thing about this is, here is a non-priest. We might think of him as a religious non-technician. He's not a religious authority, at least by the standards of his people. And he's praying this prayer, and he's making these admissions, and he's this knowledgeable and versed in the word and what God expects and what God requires. How could a Christian be any less? How is there any way that a child of God should be any less familiar with what God requires? And yet we live in a time, in a society, in a place where the standard response for most of our neighbors to any serious-minded religious question is what? Well, let me go ask my pastor about that. I forget who the author is. I want to say it's John R.W. Stott, but I'm not 100% sure. I've got the book. I can see the title. I can't see the author's name on the cover in my mind's eye. But the title of the book is something along the lines, it is a denominational minister writing for pastors generally. And the title of the book is something along the lines of, Brothers, We Are Not Professionals. And he has a point in his writing. It's a fairly small volume. He has more of a point, I think, than he even realizes, that a gospel preacher is not a professional pastor, must not be a professional pastor. God's man cannot afford to be the replacement in people's minds and lives for personal conviction and knowledge and faith. But that's exactly what most of denominationalism does. And that's what not a few Christians try to do with preachers and occasionally elders. I'll have to ask my preacher about that. No, you don't need to ask your preacher about that. You need to learn it for yourself. Well, let me get back down off my soapbox. So here you have a confession by a man who is not a religious specialist, you might say. And what we have here is a model of how knowledgeable and how aware of personal responsibility and corporate responsibility every Christian ought to be. So look down to verse 11 then, and as we come to the conclusion, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king. Now we learn who this man is. This man is the king. You read some commentators and they say that Nehemiah is speaking disdainfully of the king by referring to him as this man. But that's a phrase that we find over and over and over through the scriptures, and it's not always applied in a sense of disdain or arrogance or whatnot. It simply is a recognition that you're God, and even though he's king, he's just a man. So it's a distinction, really it's a distinction between God over all and this man over his kingdom. So the desire that he expresses here, let your ear be attentive to the prayer, to those who delight to fear you, give success, grant him mercy. All of these things a reference to his appeal to God to be favorable to my request. And he says, I was cupbearer, high-ranking office, a very personal relationship with the king. After all, Nehemiah's life is on the line every time he hands the king the cup, whether it's by being poisoned himself or by somehow displeasing the king. So we come into chapter 2, and here is where Nehemiah is given permission to make the trip to Jerusalem. And that's the first 10 verses of chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Now you go back to chapter 1 and verse 1, the month of Kislev in the 20th year, that's the 20th year of the king's reign. So that dates this for us actually very exactly to the year 445. Possibly, if you want to quibble about it, it would be early 444, depending on how the Persians count, whether he's using the Persian calendar or the Hebrew calendar for the years of the king. We know he's using Hebrew months, but this is the 20th year. So that gives us basically a 12-month window that we can establish with pretty much absolute certainty the time frame, because from secular archaeological records, we know exactly when Artaxerxes ruled, from 464 465, 464, down to 424. So, in the 20th year of the king's reign, in the month of Nisan. Now, this is 4 months later after he's heard this. 4 months of prayer, 4 months of fasting, 4 months of mourning, 4 months of pondering what to do, and 4 months of asking God for guidance. I was cupbearer to the king, and he's sad in the king's presence. Notice how he describes the circumstances here. In the 20th month of Nisan, 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. It was the responsibility of those in the court to be cheerful, to be upbeat. Appearing sad has all kinds of bad connotations in this setting, not the least of which is the superstition of the king and his soothsayers. The idea that someone would be sad in his presence could very well be interpreted as a bad omen. And a bad omen, a bad sign, we want to get that out of here as quickly as possible. We don't want that to rub off on the king. But he asks, why do you look sad? Think about it from the king's point of view. When in his life has anybody who served him ever appeared sad in his presence? Probably never.
Mm-hmm.
He would know what sadness is because he's king. He's military leader. He has imposed his rule on other peoples. He has executed sentence against individuals. So he's seen sadness. He's caused sadness. But to find someone of his trusted servants who appears sad, this is a whole new situation for him. So what do we do about this? Well, why are you sad? Being caught sad, Nehemiah says, I was terrified. Here's my life on the line, basically. Is he going to think I'm plotting something against him? Is someone else going to plant that thought in it? Think about Nehemiah's position in the court. He's not a counselor. He's not an advisor, but he's present a lot of the time when the most powerful men in the nation, in the kingdom, are there. How much is he going to hear just on a day in, day out basis of the politicking and the counsel and the discussion back and forth? He'd have to be highly trusted not to reveal that to the king's enemies. Oh dear. Let me pause this just a second. I need to answer this. This is kin folks. Okay. We had just scared the pants off of Nehemiah, as it were. So the king gives him an opportunity to explain himself, which is probably an indication of the level of trust and the reputation that he has. He's not just summarily hurried out or disposed of because he's sad in the king's presence. So, why are you sad? You're not sick. This is sadness of the heart. It's almost as if, is this woman trouble or what have you? But at verse 3, he has this responsibility to make a careful answer, a careful explanation. And he answers very respectfully. He mentions his own ancestors, and that would, the king here, Artaxerxes, the Persians, Medes, they were basically an orientally rooted people, and so that would strike a chord with them. So I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Now, this is the same king who has previously, in Ezra's time, pretty well stopped things. And one of the things to remember about the Medes and the Persians, once something is inscribed in law, it's pretty well unrepealable. So whether he had passed a law or not, that may be all the difference here, whether there was actually a law or simply a commandment. But regardless, this is putting Nehemiah in a position where he's about to ask something. It's going to be a big ask on his part. So he answers very carefully, answers in a way that would certainly resonate. My ancestors' graves, my ancestors' city, this is a ruin. This is a grief of soul for me. Answers in a way that the king would relate to. And so at verses 4 and 5, you notice one of the interesting things here is that he prays even as he is making the request to the king. So he says, the king said to me, what are you requesting? And I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, what I'm asking is that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. All right. Send me to Judah. And he doesn't specify the city. He simply says the city of my father's graves. Well, he prays even as he's making this request. And at verse 6, you have then the response. The king said, how long? The queen is sitting beside him. How long will you be gone? When will you return? It pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. Well, how long did he say? We don't know. We know what the time involved in travel to and from would be, a minimum of 6 months round trip, probably more like 7 or 8. At this point, Nehemiah is simply asking for himself to go. It doesn't appear that he's asked for any detachment of troops or anything like that, or any official capacity. He just wants to go and take on this job that needs to be done. The note that the queen is sitting beside him suggests that this occurs in a social setting rather than in the ordinary affairs of the government, ordinary daily business. It's possible the reference to the queen, these kings tended to be polygamous, tended to have a harem. There is one scholar / commentator, older, whose name I can't call off the top of my head now, who asserts that this particular king had only one wife, Demetrius, I think was her name. But he is in the minority in that assertion. And there are more than a few who suggest that the queen here may be the queen mother. And if that's the case, it could possibly be Esther. If that's the case, certainly she would be an encourager, a reason for the king to grant the request. But we have no way of knowing that. That's only a possibility. Now, how long? Minimum, probably 8 months round trip, 6 to 8 months round trip. How long would it take to rebuild the city? Well, even if he hasn't specified the city, what can the king deduce from this? Who
Be gone a while.
he's going to be gone a while. He's asking permission to go and rebuild a city. that doesn't get done overnight. He knows Nehemiah. Who would typically be chosen for a job like this, being cupbearer to the king? Well, it wouldn't be just Shlomo off the street. It would be someone high ranking among the captives, among the servants. Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were princes of Israel when they were taken into captivity. They were the upper echelons. These were the people that were incorporated into the Babylonian and then the Medo-Persian government. There's no reason for us to suppose that the Medes and the Persians did not continue this practice in their captives of taking the upper echelons into their service. So it would be very possible, if not probable, that the king would know something of Nehemiah's family background. If he is of the tribe of Judah, and we would assume that he would be, if he is of the royal house, that's maybe debatable. When he says the city of my fathers, well, what city would that be? Almost certainly Jerusalem, without even having to think about it. What city would be associated with Jews throughout antiquity and throughout the world? Jerusalem, more than any other. So he says, the city of my fathers. I want to go rebuild the city of my fathers. How long are you going to be gone? Well, I set him a time. It's a temporary mission. It's time limited. Now, how much time did he set? No idea. A year, 2 years, 3 years? He's asking for a leave of absence from the court. Well, during that time, what could happen? The government could change. The king could die or be overthrown. Nehemiah could be unable to complete the project in the allotted time. All sorts of things could happen. But then he goes on here. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through till I come to Judah. Here's a concern for Nehemiah, not for the king. He knows, at least in part, who's at the root of some of the problems that Judah and Jerusalem have encountered. He's talked to Hanani and to the others from Judah. So what are they facing? Well, we've got the priests who are not as committed as they ought to be, at least some of them, who are very secular and not focused on the law as they should be. We've got the general malaise in the population, because as the leadership goes, so go the people. We've got Judah, or Judea as it's beginning to be known, that is part of, or seemingly is part of, the province beyond the river. Well, what's that? That's territory that's not controlled by Jews, but by people that are inimical to the Jews. And every time they've tried to make any progress, what do these people do? They stymie them in one way or another. They did get the temple built, but that took 20 years and an express order to let that go forward after it had been idle for 15 years. As far as reestablishing the city of Jerusalem as anything more than a collection of huts around the temple, not much has been able to be accomplished. They've attempted to build the wall. What wall they have built, whether it is from Ezra's efforts or not, is in ruins, and the gates have been burnt. It's very not just possible, but probable that some of these neighboring people, under the leadership, or at least with the tacit permission of men like Sanballat and Tobiah, have raided and torn down whatever the Jews have tried to build. And so here now, Nehemiah has heard of these things, and now he makes this request. I need a passport, Your Majesty. The governor of the province beyond the river, if he gets wind, what he says amounts to, if he gets wind of what I'm going there to do, he'll stop me. So I need an authorization that will carry me over, that will let me pass through without hindrance. And it's interesting to come down here then to verse 8 and see how the king responds, because it gives us a little insight into just how well liked, how well respected, in what high esteem Nehemiah must have been held. If it's, if it pleases the king, let me have letters to the governor of the province beyond the river to let me come to Judah, a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, to give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple. That's the citadel or the palace that adjoins the temple, the castle, basically, that would tend to surround it. Coming down to the first century, BC and AD, this is the same basic structure that Herod the Great remodels and enlarges, that is known to us as the Fortress Antonia in the first century. And of course, Herod greatly enlarged it and fortified it and so forth. But it's the same basic structure that Nehemiah is talking about here. So I need authorization for materials to build this, and for the house that I'll occupy. And that seems to imply that he's going to build himself a house, maybe as part of this fortress facility. And notice the king granted what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. So the king gives him supplies. He gives him authorization for supplies to rebuild the citadel, or the fortress beside the temple, to repair the walls, the gates, and so on and so forth, and to build himself a house as governor. Now, the forest that he mentions here, that word is the word pardes, and it can refer to literally to a paradise, or to a park, a place planted with trees, an enclosed hunting ground. And this may be a reference either to the ancient cedars of Lebanon, where Solomon had gotten timber, David before him, or it may be a reference to Solomon's ancient gardens, things that Solomon planted, because we know that he was a builder and a planter, as well as a politician and a trader and all kinds of other things. The point comes there at the end of verse 8, the good hand of my God was upon me. In other words, the king granted what I requested because it was God's will. And Nehemiah, over and over, this is a theme that we see over and over in Nehemiah, is that he acknowledges everything he accomplishes is to God's credit, not to his own. And that sets Nehemiah apart. Really, all the faithful men of God, the prophets, the apostles in the New Testament, and so forth. But it sets them apart from those who parade themselves, who impose or are imposters in this, because he gives God the credit in all of this. And rightly so. So the king gives him the supplies, gives him the authorization, and pick up in 9 and 10 now. And here it begins to get interesting. I came to the governors of the province beyond the river. And this would be Sanballat, who seems to be the governor of Samaria, and Tobiah, who is apparently the governor of the Ammonites. I gave them the king's letters. The king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant I'm sorry, I misread that. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. Well, they put two and two together. Of course, Nehemiah's dress, Nehemiah's speech, everything about him, and we look at we neglect sometimes to look at how well known Nehemiah probably was. These guys are not happy because they recognize that Nehemiah is a Jew. Do they know him? If they've ever been in the king's palace, and if they're governors of these provinces, they probably have, they would know exactly who he is and who he represents. They would have seen him basically at the king's right hand. Now, he's not a counselor to the king, but he's a man who, if he's not directly influential, he's indirectly influential in the court, because he knows what goes on. He knows who comes and goes. He knows all the high-ranking officials and what have you. And he is noted for his trustworthiness. Now, I got a little pop-up message a minute ago, said the internet was unstable, and I'm hearing a little popping. Are you able to hear me? Okay.
It's slow every now and then, but it comes through eventually okay.
Okay. Well, we'll keep going then. I'm not hotspotting. The Wi-Fi for the facilities here is literally 2 doors over, and so more people log on to watch Netflix or whatnot, it may knock us off, but so far
Yeah.
good. So he travels to Jerusalem. He encounters the governors of the provinces beyond the river. I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. 3 days, as they count time, could have been as little as 26 hours, an hour of this day, all of this day, and an hour of the next day. Regardless, he was there a very brief time. And what does he do? In the middle of the night, I rose in the night and began my survey. I and a few men with me, I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. So he starts to survey the situation. He has not told the governors as he passed through what he was going there to do. He simply has been sent there. He presents his passport, his letters of authorization. They rightly conclude that he has the king's backing for whatever it is he's going to do, and that's not good for them, for Sanballat and Tobiah. So they're not happy about it. But Nehemiah hasn't let on what he's there to do. He doesn't even tell anybody when he gets there. He just shows up with his letters of authorization in hand. So I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by a fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, so returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, the rest who were to do the work. So they know he's there. They know he came from Shushan. He's come with the king's authority to come. That's all they know. Now he talks about the route that he takes. He leaves by the northern gate and he makes a counterclockwise circle most of the way around the city until he gets around over to the Kidron Valley side. And then he basically has to turn around and go back the way he came. The reason for this historically is that from the days of Solomon forward, the outfall from the city walls down into the Kidron Valley had been terraced so that you could traverse it all the way around. But in the destruction of the city by Nebuchadnezzar, when the walls were destroyed, the terraces collapsed as well. So that down that eastern slope into the Kidron Valley was just a giant field of rubble and scree, and Nehemiah was no longer able to pass around that way. There was no way for him and his animal to go that way. So he had to turn around and go back the way he came at this point. Thus far, he hasn't let anyone in on what he's there to do. But now he's about to open the bag, as it were, and tell them what's going on. Verse 17, you have the keys to success here. I said to them, you see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words the king had spoken to me. So he's got double authorization as far as his countrymen are concerned. Number one, he's got God's blessing. How does Nehemiah know that he's got God's blessing?
Because Artaxerxes approved it and got him there and
He
gave him authority.
Exactly. Artaxerxes had done everything that Nehemiah had prayed to God for him to do. So, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, so to speak. If this is not the hand of God causing this to every piece to fall into place after you've prayed for it, then what is it? Find some other explanation. So I've got God's approval, and look here, I've got the king's authorization. I've got the orders from the king. So I told them, and they said, let us rise up and build. And they strengthened their hands for the good work. All right. So at this point, Nehemiah is identifying with the leaders among the people there, the folks that are willing to carry out what he has come to do. One of the things we're going to see is that not everybody's on board with him. You pick up at verse 19, Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab, they hear about it, and their reaction is reproach. They jeered. That word means literally to pluck or to pick, to pull people apart, and that's the idea. They're poking fun. What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They're going to try the things that have worked for them before, insinuation and power of suggestion, the assertion that this is rebellion. And I replied, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will rise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. So now what Nehemiah does is he starts to lay out his cards, but he's not going to show his whole hand. You have no claim in Jerusalem. They had to let him pass because they showed him letters. He showed them letters from the king authorizing him to pass. They couldn't stop him, and he's got a military escort. So he gets to Jerusalem. They can't prevent that. Now he's going to lay out another card. You have no claim here. He's just challenged their civil authority over the territory. Now, they still have authority in their own territory, but they've had everything their way all these years. This Judah has been, if anything, no man's land, if not belonging to one of their territories. And now Nehemiah has just laid out the intimation that this territory doesn't fall under your jurisdiction anymore. So now they're going to have to get confirmation from the palace, from Shushan, before they can take any more steps against him. And this is, Nehemiah has not only identified himself with his people, just like a good leader would, but now he's begun to lay out that we're not the rebels that you say we are. And if you stop us, you're going to be violating the will of the king. Now, before we go any farther, go back into the early part of chapter 2, and notice what they do. They mock, they scorn. At verse 19, there's derision. Flip the page and look over to chapter 4 for just a minute, and notice what takes place here in chapter 4 at verse 2. In the presence of his brothers in the army of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews doing? There's mockery there. Skip down to verse 8 in chapter 4. They plotted together to fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion. Conspiracy is one of the tools arrayed against them. Flip over to chapter 6, and in chapter 6, you have this proposal in verse 2. Come down to the plains of Ono and meet with us. And Nehemiah says, I'm doing a great work. Oh no, I don't have time to go meet with you down there. Jawbone with you folks. So in verse 5 in chapter 6, there is slander levied against him. And then go down to verse 10, you have a hired traitor, someone who is presented to accuse him falsely, to stand in the way. And then you get down to chapter 16 and chapter 6 and verse 17, and now we've got internal corruption. All of these things are tools of opposition to try to frustrate the work that God has allowed Nehemiah to come there to do. And the lesson to take out of this, and the lesson that we need to keep coming back to, is that when you oppose God's people in trying to do what's right, who are you opposing? You're opposing God himself. Well, that brings us into chapter 3. And in chapter 3, we have the rebuilding of the wall, a description of it. Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brothers, the priests, and they built the sheep gate and consecrated it and set its doors, consecrated it as far as the Tower of the 100, as far as the Tower of Hananel. Well, that makes sense. The sheep gate is closest to the temple. It would serve their purposes for the priests. One of the things we're going to see is that the priests are not as on board with some of this as they ought to have been. Not all of them, at any rate. One of the things that's going to stand out is that some of the people Nehemiah has to contend with are just downright lazy. Some of them consider this work beneath them. The consequence is that some of the others have to work twice as hard to make sure that the job gets finished. And you've got people here working in accomplishing the will of God who are really, they're ahead of their leaders. And there's a lesson in that about leadership as well. But Eliashib and the priests build this section of the wall. They build the section that basically serves their purposes. Next to him, the men of Jericho built. Next to them, Zachar the son of Imri built. And then the sons of Hazaniah, the fish gate, laid its beams, set its doors, its bolts, its bars. Meremoth, the son of Uriah, son of Hakaz, repaired. Next to them was Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. Next to them was Zadok, the son of Baana. Next to them, the Tekoites repaired. But down here at verse 5, what do we discover? Their nobles would not stoop to serve their Lord. The men of Tekoa are willing to work, but their leaders, their elders, their patriarchs, are not willing to. Come down to verse 9 and notice the mention of, next to the folks there, Rephaim, the son of Hur, ruler of half the district of Jerusalem, repaired. So on the one hand, you've got the elders or the rulers, the leaders of the people of Tekoa that consider this work beneath them. And on the other hand, you've got Rephaim. These folks are doing twice as much work just to help get things done. As we go along, though, you come to verse 8, and Uzziel, the son of Hariah, goldsmiths repaired, and next to him, Hananiah, one of the perfumers, repaired, and they restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. You've got folks here working, doing brute manual labor, stacking stone, making brick, building walls that are folks from refined professions. You've got what I don't know that we think of them as white collar workers, but skilled tradesmen in other trades that are setting aside their trades and their tools in order to work on the wall. And it shows the degree of their commitment. You look down to verse 12, even some of their daughters come out to work in verse 12. Some of the women work. The next to him, Shallum, the son of Halohesh, ruler of half the district of Jerusalem, he and his daughters. So here's something that's out of the ordinary, is the women engage in this kind of manual labor. Now, Brother Ramsey, Johnny Ramsey, used to make the observation that wherever the gospel is not known, wherever the Bible is not familiar in society, the men tend to sit around and spit and scratch and smoke, and the women do all the labor. And where the knowledge of the Word of God, even imperfectly, goes, men get up off their lazy backsides and get to work, and women are elevated to their proper place in society. Well, here we find women pitching in things that are not traditionally women's work. But because of the nature of the work being done, they're very willing to step in and work. Now, at verse 13, from verse 13 down to verse 27, you have just record after record after record of these people building and repairing. Verse 14, Malchiah, the son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hakerem, repaired the dung gate. This would be the southernmost gate that dumps out into the Hinnom Valley. Set its doors, bolts, and its bars. That's interesting that the Rechabites are engaged in this, some of their descendants. And as we go around, what we see is that these people are repairing the sections of the wall, typically, that are closest to the areas where they would live in the city. And that makes perfect sense. But they're also, the description follows the order around the wall clockwise, or counterclockwise rather, basically in the same order that Nehemiah had surveyed it. So they start here on the north and they just move right on around, repairing the wall. You get down here to verse 22, you have the priests, men of the surrounding area, who are repairing some of that section. After that, Benjamin and Ashab repaired opposite their house, and Azariah, the son of Messiah, the son of Ananiah, repaired beside his own house. So we have a record here then. They're working in the areas that benefit themselves, and that makes perfect sense. But some of them are having to work twice as hard as others. And some of them are ahead of the leaders of their families or their clans, like we saw with the Tekoites. In the kingdom, in the church, sometimes we see the same thing begin to happen, where individual members will begin to recognize needs or recognize possibilities before the leadership does, before the elders, before the deacons, the preachers see that this could take place. And there can be a temptation on the part of leadership to not take that recognition seriously. That's not to say that every idea that comes out of the pew ought to be taken and run with. Sometimes you can get some harebrained ideas out of some of the pews, but by the same token, elders and preachers have come up with some pretty harebrained schemes through the years as well. So that's a sword that kind of cuts both ways. Sometimes the folks are ahead of the leadership, though, and when that's the case, leadership ought to sit up and pay attention. Well, much of the material that they needed to build basically was all around them. Now, they might have had to go down into what had been the terraces around the Kidron Valley side and haul stone back up the hill to have material to build with, but there should have been plenty of rubble to build. And it was normal in the ancient world to reuse older material. So that's exactly what they would have done. And that brings us then down here to verse 28. Above the horse gate, the priests repaired, each one opposite his own house. After them, Zadok, the son of Immer, repaired opposite his own house. After him, Shemaiah, the son of Shechaniah, the keeper of the east gate, repaired. And we go through these individual by individual, gate by gate. We get opposite the muster gate, the upper chamber of the corner. At verse 32, between the upper chamber of the corner and the sheep gate, the goldsmiths and the merchants repaired. And so that takes us then to the basically the almost completion of the wall. Chapter 4 will get us to the finish line. But before that happens, we're going to have to deal in more detail with opposition, with conflict. And that arises in the person of Sanballat and Tobiah. These guys want to hold on to power. And they've been able, for who knows how many years, to dominate what goes on in Judah and Jerusalem. That's being taken away from them. Nehemiah has showed up with an authorization that they can't argue with. But if they can cause Nehemiah to fail, if they can hinder Nehemiah so that his work is not accomplished, what does that do to his credibility with the king? That's going to ruin his credibility, and that will serve the same purpose for them, even if they're not able themselves to stop him. If they can simply throw him off, they can accomplish their purpose. And it's Sanballat who takes the lead here. Why would they be concerned about a wall around the city of Jerusalem?
They were necessarily concerned about the wall, that it was lessening their influence, lessening their power.
Okay, it does lessen their influence. It makes Jerusalem defensible. And when you think about the siting of Jerusalem, where is Jerusalem located? It's on a hill. It's uphill from every approach to get to Jerusalem. And if there's a wall around the top of the hill, then it's that much more defensible. We know that back in Solomon's day, the city was reinforced. And then Hezekiah has the Gihon spring brought in through a tunnel so that the city is basically immune to being starved out or dried out by siege. So if they rebuild the wall, then it's defensible. Why?
It took quite a few years before the Jews actually captured it.
Yeah,
from the Jebusites,
that's true too.
because it was in the time of David before they ever captured it.
That's true too. And that goes back to the Jews always stopping short of what God promised, always being satisfied with less. But why would these guys care about Jerusalem being defensible? Back in the days of Israel and Judah, we find the kings of Israel trying to build fortified cities around Jerusalem to basically bottle up Jerusalem. And they weren't successful in finishing that, but that would have given them an edge for control, but more than that, to pillage and to plunder. And that seems to be exactly what these Samaritans have in mind as far as Jerusalem is concerned. They've had their way for 20 plus years. Really, they've kind of had their way ever since the days of Zerubbabel. They've been able to thwart any effort that would prevent them outnumbering and overmastering the Jews. But now, if Nehemiah continues, they're not going to be able to run roughshod over them anymore. And that's what they're trying to prevent. It's a loss of power, a loss of dominance. These guys are governors under the rule of Artaxerxes. But that doesn't prevent them from being petty tyrants, does it?
No.
They are, as representatives of Artaxerxes in their respective territories, they're basically next to God as far as the population is concerned. And now Nehemiah is threatening to take away part of that according to this order that has allowed him to begin this work. They're going to pull out all the stops to try to prevent this. And that's where we'll pick up next time. This is a good stopping point, even though it's a little bit early tonight. So with your kind agreement, we'll call it here. If you've got comments, questions, or observations, feel free.
No, just enjoy your time. You're an hour earlier, so you gotta.
I'm hearing it.
Don't have it.
I'm hearing it begin to shower outside. So I'm in a good place. I'm inside.
Yeah.
Well, we'll stop this recording, and Lord willing, I'll see you in person next week.